It's one of the great paradoxes of Apple that for a company its size, it has behaved so entrepreneurially. It's an innovative company that does innovation at scale, and yet, at last count, it's about 70,000 plus employees, including their retail employees. And so what they've done is to be able to come up with new products on a continual basis the way an innovative startup would. One of the secrets of this is that they don't come up with a lot of products, so they put an incredible amount of energy into the few things that they do well. The great wildcard factor here is that the great entrepreneur of Apple over the last 15 years was Steve Jobs. It said entrepreneur on his death certificate, as a matter of fact. Now the company is led by people who aren't entrepreneurs. And so I never mean to suggest that Apple is a startup or thinks that it's a startup, but it has managed to behave like a startup in an astounding way considering its size. One of the most amazing realizations I made over the course of reporting the book is how little Apple is emulated. You'd think for all of its success that companies would be bending over backwards to try to figure out Apple's secret sauce and to try to copy what Apple does. That wouldn't have been the case 10 or 15 years ago when it was successful, but in a sort of niche-y way. Today, nothing is niche-y about Apple's success, and yet people don't copy it much. I think there's a few reasons for this. One is that they are an extremely risk-taking company for such a big company. They make big, brassy bets, and most businesses, almost by definition, do not make big, brassy bets. They spread their bets around in case something goes wrong. Apple's only made about 5 or 6 bets over the past 15 years, and each one has worked. And everything that's been a failure at Apple has been so insignificant that we don't spend much time talking about it. So that part, I think, is very hard for companies to emulate. It's also hard to emulate a creative, once-in-a-generation genius like Steve Jobs, and in fact, I think it's perilous to try to emulate him. One thing I think companies will emulate going forward is Apple's ability to integrate everything that it does. Now, in the technology industry, this means integrating hardware and software. They've done this extremely well where their competitors have not. In fact, we see that Microsoft is about to make a tablet that will integrate hardware and software. That is a clear emulation of the Apple way of doing things. And lastly, I think companies will begin to emulate the way Apple behaves. So I think companies would do well to be more secretive. They would be well to be more disciplined about their marketing message. They would do well to say no more often instead of saying yes. These are all Apple traits that it sort of amuses and astounds me that companies don't copy, because those are the easy ones. There's no doubt that Apple has changed hands with Sony. Sony should have been the inventor of the iPod. Sony invented the Walkman. They became a global company for that and for other reasons, but this was their market to lose, and they lost it, and Apple came and took it from them. From a technological perspective, the explanation, at least, of how that happened is straightforward, and that is that Apple was and is very good at software, and Sony never was. So Sony was very good at hardware, and they certainly understood music, and they understood the technology, but they were bad at software, and they didn't do what Apple did, which was to create iTunes so that people had a very easy way to use their device. So the Walkman was a success in an era when it didn't have to interact with computers. And that's how Apple just completely thrashed Sony in the music player business, which became a much bigger subject than just the music business. But I don't think that's the whole story. And this is where the Sony story becomes a lesson going forward that's an interesting one. What's clear in retrospect is that Sony succeeded while its great founder, Morita, was running the company, and went into decline after he was gone. And so Apple watchers are asking, will the same thing happen now that Apple isn't being run by its great founder and guiding light of the last 15 years, Steve Jobs? These are two separate subjects, and it's hard to know if they can be combined. But what's fascinating is that Sony has known for years now that it was getting beaten by Apple and what needed to be done, and it couldn't do it. So the Apple we know today that's the dominant consumer electronics company in the world is the result of the vision of one man. Now, I want to be careful not to suggest that all the successes at Apple are attributable to Steve Jobs, because they aren't. But the strategy and the culture of Apple truly are attributable to Steve Jobs and Steve Jobs alone up to this point. And so he behaved as if he were the owner of Apple. And the irony there is that when he left the company in 1986, he sold all of his shares except for one share so he could attend shareholder meetings in a huff because he was angry. And so he was not a big shareholder. Even at his death, he owned far more of Disney because of his Pixar stake than he did of Apple. But he behaved as if he controlled the company, and he ran it as a long-term company. As a long-term investment. So even in the recession of 2001, Apple was investing heavily in its products, in the iPod, and in advertising the Apple brand. This is one of the reasons why Apple has been able to have outside success, because it invested for the long term. Now, the other thing that Apple did famously under Jobs was to focus on what it wanted to do and to make products that he and his executives wanted to use. So they understood their product and they understood their customer extremely well, because in their opinion, they were the customer. And Jobs would say, we hated our smartphones. We knew we wanted to build the iPhone. We hated using PCs. We knew what changes we wanted to make to the Mac and so on. We loved using music. We loved listening to music, and so we knew what we wanted in a music player and in a jukebox software. And so by answering to themselves in terms of product features, they were able to build truly breakthrough products that their customers would also want to buy. Regarding how Apple deals with labor issues, a little history is interesting. As recently as 1998, Apple owned its own factories and warehouses, and the current CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, was actually brought in to fix Apple's broken supply chain. And he identified at the time the hands-down best company at doing this in the computer industry was Dell. And Dell used contract manufacturers in Asia. And so he said, this is not a core competency of Apple. We're going to use contract manufacturers in Asia the same way that Dell does. And so that's what Apple did. So fast forward, Apple has these criticisms of the labor standards at its factories in China. They're the same labor standards essentially as the rest of the consumer electronics industry in the West, except Apple is the leader now. They're number one, which they're still not used to, by the way. They still think of themselves as underdogs. And so I think in their hearts, they pushed this, they swept this problem under the rug for a handful of years because they thought the criticism was unfair, number one. And number two, they thought they were doing a pretty good job. They followed what they thought were industry standards in the consumer electronics industry. Now, it so happens that for some historical reasons, the consumer electronics industry is behind the apparel industry, which got criticized earlier. So Nike and Gap went through these problems 10 years ago. Now Apple's playing catch up, and in fact, they're following the same exact playbook that Nike followed 10 years ago. They've joined the same industry association, they've conducted the same audits, and there's been a bit of a sea change in the last 6 months in that they've acknowledged that they weren't as good as they could have been, and I think they're trying to get better. We haven't seen any real ramifications of this so far, positive or negative. So we haven't seen the Apple brand hurt, and we also haven't seen prices go up, which could theoretically happen. A word on Apple consumers. I believe that the great majority of Apple consumers, to the extent that they care about human rights issues, practice an extreme form of cognitive dissonance. They will tell you that they're concerned about the plight of workers, and in the same exact breath, they'll tell you how much they love their iPhone. And in my opinion, they don't intend to do a damn thing about that other than to complain and to hope that Apple will do a better job of making those products. 4 years ago now, when I wrote a cover story in Fortune about Tim Cook, the cover language was "The Genius Behind Steve." Meet the operations whiz who one day could be the CEO of Apple. People in the Valley said to me, there is no way Tim Cook will ever be CEO of Apple. That's preposterous. The reason they thought that is that this man is so different from Steve Jobs. And I've come to understand that he is CEO of Apple today because he is so different from Steve Jobs. I think Jobs was comfortable having somebody who didn't have his vision and his charisma, who wouldn't compete on the same stage with him, to be his successor, because he knew that Apple would be in good hands with Tim Cook, because Tim Cook is competent, extremely intelligent, extremely hardworking, well-liked, and loves Apple. He knows the operation. He's been there since 1998. So I think the remarkable thing about his tenure so far as CEO is that, number one, he's completely committed to the culture of Apple and to keeping Apple the same kind of company. And so he uses the language that Steve Jobs used. He says, we will say no more often than we say yes. That's an important part of the Apple culture. At the same time, he's very openly and transparently saying we're going to change some things that need to change. So we're not going to be evasive about China labor relations, for example. We're going to, not only are we going to do our best, but we're going to communicate about doing our best in China, whereas Steve Jobs was dismissive on the subject. We're going to have charity matching grants for our employees because they want it and because it's a good thing. This gets to the issue of employee morale. Steve Jobs didn't like philanthropy. Little bit of an unusual stance in the modern age, and Tim Cook said that's not necessarily the Apple way. Same with a dividend. Jobs was almost philosophically or religiously opposed to issuing dividends to shareholders, and Cook has effectively said, look, we have $110 billion on our balance sheet. It would be stupid not to grant a dividend, and so he went ahead and did it. These are examples of things changing around the edges in the culture of Apple. I don't think the core has changed yet, and if it has, it's just way too soon to know. So in analyzing Apple's future 10, 15 years out, I'm going to start with the negative, and I'm going to make the observation that the last 15 years have been one of the most incredible runs in the history of the modern corporation for Apple. And I think it would be unrealistic to expect Apple to have another 15 years like the last 15 years, even if Steve Jobs were alive and well. They've gotten too big, too complex. They're under too much scrutiny. You know, 12, 15 years ago, the people that we call fanboys, the true believers in Apple, were the only ones who watched their every move and analyzed it and criticized it. Today, we're all Apple fanboys and fangirls to some degree, and so the entire world is watching the company that is, in fact, the most valuable by market cap. And so these are some of the reasons I think they'll face tremendous challenges over the next 10 or 15 years. Now, having said that, as much as I've studied the company, the vibe I get from speaking to insiders there is that I still underappreciate how much excellence there is at Apple in terms of their brains, their process, their ability to focus in a way that companies just don't seem to do as well as they do. And so I think going forward, I can't speak to whether or not they'll be dominant 10 years from now. I think they'll absolutely be in the game in the way that Disney is still in the game some 45 years after Walt Disney died, with the acknowledgement that they had some bad years in the middle there.